In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen.
Sante Patrice,
Ora pro nobis.
Sante Brigita,
Ora pro nobis.
Sante Columbanus,
Ora pro
in
nobis.
nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Okay, we're looking still at the history of the liturgical revolution. And we're looking specifically at the dialogue mass. Oh, Michael, the fan, please. We left off on page 63. Detached and silent spectators. So that was the pejorative terms used for those who want to be silent at Mass and just pray. This is a quote from Pope Paul VI in his work Marialis Cultus, 1974. There are those who, without wholesome liturgical and pastoral criteria, mix practices of piety and liturgical acts in hybrid celebrations. It sometimes happens that novenas or similar practices of piety are inserted into the very celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice. This creates the danger that the Lord's memorial rite Father, what are you going to do right now? I have to say the Lord's memorial rite. Are you kidding? This is how he's calling the Mass. You know, the Council of Trent never calls it this. This creates the danger that the Lord's memorial rite, instead of being the culmination of the meeting of the Christian community, becomes the occasion, as it were, for devotional practices. For those who act in this way, we wish to recall the rule laid down by the Council, Vatican II, of course, prescribing that exercises of piety should be harmonized with the liturgy, not merged into it. Bold print, it is a mistake to recite the rosary during the celebration of the liturgy, though unfortunately this practice still persists here and there. Pope Paul VI. So even kind of scorning the rosary. You hear all these stories as a priest, but one man, I think, told me, or one lady, when they brought in the changes, the priest at the pulpit took a rosary and broke them and said, "You won't need these anymore." Now that things have come into the open, we can see what had been hidden from us in the years preceding Vatican II and where it has led. Next, the beginning of the end of papal protection for liturgical tradition. Michael?
With his support for congregational singing and responsives in Divini Cultus, Pope Pius XI produced a landmark mandate for change which corresponded neither with the lex orandi of the Roman Rite, nor with the requirements, interests, or desires of the Catholic faithful who had been worshiping in silence for centuries. Pius XI is reported to have publicly celebrated the Dialogue Mass himself in 1922 and 1925, and to have encouraged individuals and groups who were consciously advancing in the liturgical revolution. It is not surprising, therefore, that by the late 1920s, liturgical experimentation was already well underway on the continent of Europe, especially in some Benedictine abbeys. In the German-speaking lands.
Footnote, even as early as 1914, at the Benedictine Abbey of Maria Laach in Germany, Abbot Herwegen had celebrated the Dialogue Mass in German. That was 1914. In 1921, the first Mass facing the people was celebrated in the Abbey crypt. So see how early these corruptions are coming in.
Father,
Yeah.
is that footnote in here?
Footnote number 117.
That's not what it says.
Ours just says this applies especially to the work of Father Pius Podk in Vienna, and then Father Romano Guardini.
Oh, you don't have that footnote?
No.
Strange. Yeah, I don't know. This is copyright 2020. When is yours?
2020.
Yeah.
Strange. Anyway, there it is in this. So 1914, Dialogue Mass. 1921, they're already experimenting, facing the people. And Europe was more progressive even than the United States in certain pockets. All right, go on.
As well as in parts of America.
Okay, footnote 118. Don't you have footnote 117?
We do.
We do, but it just said what
It's
Gabriel
different.
read. It's different than what you read.
All right, 118. This applies especially to the work of Father Pius Parsk in Vienna and Father Romano Guardini in Bavaria, who overtook Baudouin's leadership in this field.
That's what our 117 footnote
Yeah.
says.
Oh,
So we're like one footnote short.
Yeah.
that's odd. Anyway, Father Pius Parsk, he wrote a lot on the liturgy, so did Father Guardini. And I have to say, in the seminary in Ridgefield and in Winona, and certainly now in Virginia, these books were very available to the seminarians. I remember a lot of seminarians reading their works, to get, to deepen their love of the Mass and understanding of it. But it'd have to be with a huge caveat, wouldn't it? Because these are all part of that. They're all uncles to Bonini. So their whole mindset is community, assembly theology, active. So if you as seminarians start reading those works, well, it won't be surprising as priests you'd have no problem with the dialogue mass. So these books didn't exist in our day. These good books, really getting into the engine of the liturgical revolution. They didn't exist. Father Chikada's book is an excellent work. And then Carol Burns' book here is very good. And this is volume 1. There's a volume 2 also. Go on.
This involved dialogue mass, facing the people, vernacular responses, congregational singing, offertory procession, handshaking, etc. All of which went into the melting pot to merge as a ready-made template for a democratized liturgy. So, by the time of Pius XI issued Divini Cultus in 1928, the vague expression, active participation, had a circumscribed meaning among the reformers, but was unknown among the mass of ordinary Catholics who had never asked for it. This suggests that the spirit which hovered over Pius XI when he recommended active participation was akin to the spirit of Baudouin, which eventually gave rise to a new perception of the church and the priesthood.
Okay, so when the Pope acts as a private theologian, he's not infallible. And Pius XI was known to make 2 gigantic big mistakes. This is probably the third. First big mistake, he condemned Action Française, which was a movement started by, what was his name again? Anyway, it was a Catholic monarchist. He wasn't Catholic, but all his ideas were Catholic, and he was upholding the monarchy for France. And what was his name? How could I forget? The founder of l'Action Française. Anyway, it was a good movement, and most of the traditional Catholics of the time, this was in the 1910s and 20s, were supporting it. They were full support in it. Even Archbishop Lefebvre's parents supported it. When he was in the seminary, there was a big support for it. Then Pius XI condemned it. And that was like breaking the backbone of a Catholic resurgence in France. And most authors admit that. It was a terrible mistake. Terrible mistake. The second big mistake was betraying the Cristeros in Mexico. He believed the liberal bishops. He even wrote 2 encyclicals on the persecution in Mexico and praised the young adolescent martyrs going to death, refusing blindfold, shouting Viva Cristo Rey. But he still betrayed the Cristeros in a big way, especially in the second and third wave. So that's the second huge mistake. And I think we can argue this is the third big mistake, is given his papal support to the dialogue, active participation.
Wait, I'm sorry, the encyclicals were for all of the Cristeros, or they were?
The encyclicals praised them, but in his actions he betrayed them and left them to be slaughtered by the government. Of course, he's not going to go fly to Mexico and talk to the Cristeros. He's a pope in Rome, but he did believe the bishops who betrayed their Cristeros. So the blame is more on the bishops, the liberal bishops. The Pius XI, I'm sure there was good bishops who tried to tell him, no, don't support the Masonic government. Like Bishop Orozco. He was a great bishop. He was saying Mass with the Cristeros in the mountains of Colima, out in the wilderness. They were having Mass. And there was a Cardinal Gaspari wrote to Bishop Orozco from Rome, why are you supporting these filthy peasants? And Bishop Orozco wrote back and said, if you saw the faith of these people, you would compare it to the faith of the early Catholics in the catacombs and who went to martyrdom. So that's the beauty of the Cristero war, resistance, because it was purely Catholic, purely for the faith. Not like the Byzantines, always political and second intentions. It's not pure like that. I mean, impure like that. It's a pure fight for the faith. And look at the proof, is all the martyrs. Dozens and dozens of priests, sisters exiled, young people shot. So, 3 big mistakes of Pius XI. So, because the comeback is going to be, well, why you shouldn't be against the dialogue Mass, because look, Pius XI approved it. And so did, John the 23rd and all them. But we can say, look, not everything a pope decides and does is infallible. Not everything. And don't we know that from the last 5 popes? So they can make mistakes. And I argue, because they had ignored Our Lady of Fatima, they lost a lot of graces and made big mistakes. Pius XII especially. He should have consecrated Russia the way Our Lady asked. He refused. And he made some also big mistakes and left loopholes on evolution, loopholes on NFP, natural family planning, and then right under his nose, they were destroying the liturgy. And did he sign on these things? Most say he did. But in his last 5 years as Pope, he was very sick. So, and then Bonini always had access to his office. So, the Pope is probably, throwing up, has a headache, and he's really, really, here, sign this, Holy Father. Sign this too. Oh, by the way, sign this one too. And the last one happens to be the worst document. Overthrowing the Holy Week and all that. So, I think because the popes ignored Fatima, they were partly punished. And then, all right. So the democratized liturgy. All right. So, go on, Michael. By the time, we already read that, right?
Yes, Father, we finished that.
Okay, back to the sources. Resourcement. Anthony?
A sizable section of the Vini Cultus is devoted to the standard propaganda employed by the reformers about congregational singing in the early history of the Church. In proposing active participation, Pius XI was certainly influenced by the modernist search for a more authentic form of participation, predicated on the belief that the congregational singing of the early Christian era was the original and therefore the true method for the laity to follow. He listened to the advice of the reformers who believed that the church's lex orandi had been defective for centuries and had deprived the laity of their true participation in it. The underlying assumption is that after 14 centuries of idle watching and listening, it was only in the 20th century that the Catholic congregation was restored to its quote-unquote rightful role of singing and speaking in the liturgy. Implicit in this vision was an attack on what the reformers called devotionalism, but which was in reality the venerable practice of private mental prayer made by the faithful during Mass, deemed to have sullied the purity of the original Christian liturgy. Thus, active participation, understood as an attempt to retrieve a lost primitive ideal, has a utopian and ideological edge to it. Because it was the brainchild of liturgists, historians, and politically motivated parties interested in advancing their respective careers, it could hardly be called a truly pastoral reform. Now we can see the background of Pius XI's unworthy rebuke to the faithful, who were praying silently at Mass as, quote, detached and silent spectators, end quote. Unlike his sainted predecessor, he had allowed himself to be influenced by the modernists' preference for a return to the sources of Christian liturgy, known technically as ressourcement.
The new concept of the church as that of the people. Gabriel?
Pope Pius X had taught that the singing of the liturgy was a function of the sacerdotal office, that is, a prerogative of the ordained ministers of the altar and the choirs of Levites. Pius XI, on the contrary, presented it as the right and duty of all the baptized, whether clerical or lay. In these two approaches, the former strictly clerical, the latter open and democratic, we find an echo of the types of liturgies characteristic of two opposing religions, Catholicism and Protestantism. One cannot help drawing the inference that such a revolutionary move on the part of Pius XI echoes their doctrinal conflicts as well. As the 16th century Protestant reformers rejected the Catholic priesthood, their congregational singing was among the most efficient agencies in carrying this principle to the minds of the people. It can be regarded as a liturgical expression of principles common to Protestantism and embodied in Lutheranism and Calvinism alike. One wonders, therefore, what place such a practice might be thought to have in a Catholic liturgy, codified by order of the Council of Trent, until the realization dawned that congregational singing was the sine qua non of the liturgical movement initiated by Baudouin for the purposes of promoting ecumenism.
Okay, here's a little bit on Charles Maurras, is his name, a French. Born April 20th, 1868, died November 1952. Was a French author, politician, poet, and critic. He was an organizer and principal philosopher of Action Française, a political movement that was monarchist, medievalist, conservative, corporatist, integralist, nationalist, traditionalist, and counter-revolutionary. So all the good things. Maurras also held anti-capitalist, anti-communist, anti-liberal, anti-Masonic, anti-Nazi, anti-Protestant, and anti-Semitic views. Of course, I got to throw that in. His ideas greatly influenced national Catholicism and integral nationalism, and led to the political doctrine of Maurrassisme. So, while raised Roman Catholic, Maurras went deaf and became an agnostic in his youth, but remained anti-secularist and politically supportive of the Catholic Church. An Orleanist, he began his career by writing literary criticism and became politically active as a leading anti-Dreyfusard. In 1926, Pope Pius XI issued a papal condemnation of Action Française. That was 1926. So Archbishop Lefebvre was in the seminary, just beginning the seminary at the time. And he remembers this. And he, that kind of woke up a lot of their eyes that something's going wrong in Rome. In 1927, several of Maurras's works were put on the Index of Forbidden Books. Action Française became the first newspaper to ever be placed on the Catholic Church's list of banned books and AF members, Action Française members, were forbidden from receiving the sacraments. This was later revoked in 1939 by Pope Pius XII. So they really came hard on these people when they were the friends. And the liberals just blossomed because of this. All right, so, yeah, there's a lot more, but suffice that to say. It was and the Archbishop says too, it was a real unfortunate move for France. It was really it kind of broke the hope of the Catholic resistance in France. So a pope can make a stupid mistake. When did a pope make a huge mistake? In the 1700s. Huge. Broke the backbone of the Catholic resurgence. Anybody? And it happened twice. Ever hear of the Jesuits?
Oh, yes.
The suppression of the Jesuit order? That was satanic. But it was the Pope who ordered it.
Was that Pope Pius? No.
I don't remember which Pope. I think one of the Clements. And a huge mistake. I mean, just for example, this is what the movie The Mission is about. If you ever watched the movie The Mission, it's about the reductions in South America. They were called reductions, where similar to in the United States, the missions of Father Serra. And these were huge missions where the Jesuit priests taught the Indians how to build, have farms. So what you had was just like a gigantic monastery. When all the families lived around, all the Indian tribes, and they would come to Mass, they would work the fields, pray divine office, learn the catechism, huge, beautiful choirs, built beautiful churches. And it's right in the crust of all this that the Freemasons somehow got to the Pope in Rome, and he suppressed the Jesuits. So they were all ordered, you have to abandon the missions. And I mean, imagine being one of the priests. You just converted all these people. They're dependent on the priests. And the priests are ordered, you have to abandon all these people to the pagans. So some of the priests said, I can't leave my flock. I just can't leave them. So they, quote unquote, disobeyed. And then the Portuguese, some of the wretched Portuguese, who were also Catholic, but not good Catholics, they came in and slaughtered a lot of the Indian tribes and took them as slaves. And that's a fact too. So that's what the movie The Mission is based on, although, the movie's not perfect, but you do get the message of the great work of the priests, and then it was slammed. And then all over Europe, the Jesuits were suppressed. It was an evil move. So think of the Jesuits. The first wave of Jesuits were all those tremendous saints. Saint Roch and two other saints down in Paraguay. When they martyred Saint Roch, they burnt them alive, and his heart never burned. So his heart's incorrupt. Of the three priests, their hearts are incorrupt. And then up here we have the great Jesuits, the North American martyrs, St. John de Brebeuf, St. Isaac Jogues, and then all the saints throughout all of Europe, St. Peter Canisius. So that first wave of Jesuits were just great, great saints. And then once they were smashed by the Pope, they recovered, but never with that same spirit of St. Ignatius. So the Masons, I don't know how they do it, but they got to the Pope, and it happened twice. So, it's not, people will argue against us. Well, Pius XI is Pope. You should be doing the dialogue mass because the Pope approved it. Well, maybe it was a mistake. Just like he made a mistake condemning Action Française, betraying the Cristeros, and supporting the dialogue mass. I mean, the Pope is infallible only under certain conditions, but not everything else. And even these good popes. All right. Where'd we leave off?
Presaging Vatican II.
Presaging Vatican II. Of particular note is the work of Father Romano Guardini, who promoted, quote, active participation in the 1920s at Berg Rothenfels, where he lived in community with members of the German youth movement. Footnote, as director of the German youth movement, Quickborn, which operated in Berg Rothenfels, a castle near the River Main, he pursued the most radical liturgical reforms. He became one of Pope Benedict XVI's favorite theologians. Romano Guardini, yeah, there's a lot of his books. His link with Vatican II has been noted by Karl Rahner. He's another rat, Karl Rahner. Here's Karl Rahner speaking. It is widely known fact that the Rothenfels experience was the immediate model for the liturgical reforms of Vatican II. Quote unquote, Karl Rahner. In other words, at this kind of a big boys' school, they were exposing the boys to all these revolutionary practices, facing the people for Mass, dialogue Mass, and all these weird things going on. We cannot overlook the fact that Pius XI's promotion of active participation has had a significant bearing on the direction of the liturgical revolution and has been one element in facilitating the confusion between clerical and lay roles that would later afflict the Church. He could have suppressed the bourgeoisie, the newly born movement, but instead of nipping it in the bud, he allowed the ever-expanding revolution to continue in its nefarious course. Next, imprecise language breeds dangerous policies. Michael?
The problem with using imprecise language in official documents is that it can be used to confer wider and more arbitrary powers on commissions and regulatory bodies that employ it, which is how Episcopal conferences could so easily implement active participation after Vatican II. The unfortunate result, as the dismal history of liturgical reform has shown, was that the faithful were no longer protected from the arbitrary power of the bishops to impose on them their own agenda of active participation. The phrase became a powerful tool with which to later demolish the Catholic bastions they hated, not just devotionalism, but the unique status of the priest, the rubricism of the Tridentine Mass, and the whole system of scholasticism. Unless these essentials were guaranteed by papal authority, nothing of the original Church would be left standing. Indeed, it could not be otherwise. If we scratch the surface of Divini Cultus, we can see a quiet revolution taking place to open up the liturgy to popular involvement. It also shows a growing contempt for the strictures imposed by Pius X on women choir members. We can conclude, therefore, that Divini Cultus, with its emphasis on an active participation, which was far from universal or traditional, can be said to have made a vital contribution to the emergence of progressivism in the liturgical domain.
Yeah, so who said we must raise the bastions? What recent cardinal and pope said we must raise down the bastions? Raise them. Tear them down.
Benedict the 16th.
Yeah, he's known for saying that. We got to get rid of the old bastions. Christ the King, Catholic universities, Catholic seminaries, the Tridentine Mass, everything built up by the Catholic tradition. We got to raise it all down. And that's the modernists. Chapter 6, Pius XII, a vacillating pope. What's vacillating mean? It means...
Does that mean back and forth?
Yeah, back and forth. Not steady. He's kind of blowing in the wind. A reed blowing in the wind. Right? Anthony.
By the time Pius XII was elected Pope in 1939, neo-modernism had already begun to reestablish itself in the Church with the rise of the New Theology and to make itself manifest in the liturgy, the place where the ordinary Catholic comes regularly into touch with the faith. We have seen how the slogan, active participation, has become the watchword for liturgical reform, and has acted as a catalyst to change the face of Catholic worship. But the real revolt was not superficial. It was aimed at changing the fundamentals of the faith itself, especially the doctrine of the Eucharist and the priesthood.
Okay, repeat that last sentence.
But the real revolt was not superficial. It was aimed at changing the fundamentals of the faith itself, especially the doctrine of the Eucharist and the priesthood.
So the heart of the fight for the enemies of Christ here is to attack what?
The Eucharist and the priesthood.
The doctrine. Attack the doctrine, especially these fundamental ones. So it's a real war going on here. And Pius XI didn't pick it up. And Pius XII, he should have obeyed Our Lady of Fatima. He wouldn't have been seduced. Remember the pictures with the Von Trapp family that settled over here in Vermont, an hour away? Remember the pictures of their priest that came with them, saying Mass facing the people?
Yes.
All right, and that was back in the 40s and 50s. Remember that?
Yeah.
So now you know why. Because they came out of Austria, which is near Germany, and they were already progressive in, these liturgical, bizarre practices, facing the people, active participation, dialogue Mass. It was surprising to see that picture. And then the priest is, rarely in his cassock, rarely, even in his collar. And he lived with the Von Trapp family. And that was before Vatican II. So you see the progressive ideas were already entrenched. They're already there, right? This is way back in the 20s. And then 1938 was the outbreak of what? World War II. So that was another shakeup. So the enemies of Christ were attacking at all grounds. The political grounds by causing the world wars, and then in the church they were infiltrating, right under their nose, in a doorway they didn't expect, through the sacred liturgy. So repeat that last sentence deliberately, loudly, and clearly.
But the real revolt was not superficial. It was aimed at changing the fundamentals of the faith itself, especially the doctrine of the Eucharist and the priesthood.
Go on.
The slogan also raises deeper questions. How has it been so easy for the reformers to change the way Catholics have been participating in the Mass for centuries? How have they been allowed to alter the fundamentals of the faith, as expressed in the Tridentine liturgy? The answer lies in the fact that it was the popes themselves who personally promoted active participation of the laity, first tentatively, and then in increasingly stronger doses. In this way, they advanced the agenda of the reformers and effectively undermined the objections of the faithful. Pius XII tried to solve the problem by taking both sides of the dispute. First point, he prophesied about the, quote, suicide of altering the faith in the church's liturgy, unquote, but appointed Father Annibale Bugnini as its gravedigger when he fatally made him secretary of the Commission for Liturgical Reform in 1948.
Okay, footnote. Then, still in the reign of Pius XII, he was appointed, Bonini, was appointed consultor to the Sacred Congregation of Rites, 1956, and 2, professor of sacred liturgy in the Lateran University, 1957. So you can imagine what he was teaching. These backward Tridentine practices from the dark Middle Ages. We have to go back to the early church and have congregational singing and assembly. And sound familiar, right? Yeah. So what rottenness. So the Pope, Pius XII, here he is. He sees that's a suicide of altering the faith in the church's liturgy. And some think that he knows this because he read the Third Secret of Fatima. That it has something to do with overthrowing the sacred Mass and sacraments. Suicide of altering the faith in the church's liturgy. And he only gets that, according to one author, from having read the Third Secret. So that might be an insight into the Third Secret, that might mention the spread of communism will be also political, but also in the church. by overthrowing the Mass. So, at one point, he sees you can't change the Mass, but then he appoints the gravedigger, the euthanasia doctor, Annibale Bonini. So that's a contradiction, isn't it? Or he didn't know Bonini too well. And Bonini, being a Mason, he was probably a pretty slippery character. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.